Hi, welcome to the Pandemic Baseball Book Club once again. My name is Lincoln Mitchell, and I'll be speaking today with Danny Gallagher. Danny is most recently the author of Bases Loaded, Inside Stories about Eli, Crow, Cy, Terminator, and the Expos. I don't believe in always giving long bios, but I want to tell you a little bit about who Danny is. He's a writer, author, and Montreal Expos historian. He grew up in Douglas, Ontario, and has worked for a number of weekly and daily newspapers throughout Canada, including the Montreal Daily News, where he was the Expos beat writer beginning in 1988. He has written hundreds of articles about the Expos, 8 books about the Expos, and a total of 12 books overall. So, Danny, welcome to the Pandemic Baseball Book Club podcast and YouTube. It's great to have you.
Thanks very much for having me on there, Lincoln.
I have to say, I enjoyed this book a lot, and I'm not an Expos fan, although we'll get into it later. I've always had warm feelings for the team, even back when they existed. But I love reading about teams. So much of baseball history is, the 1927 Yankees, the Boys of Summer Dodgers, but teams that don't put it all together also can be fascinating. So maybe we can begin. Tell us a little bit about your background with the Expos and what made you want to write this book about the Expos, not your first Expos book, but this book.
Well, I became an Expos beat writer in 1988, and since then I've written, hundreds of articles about the Expos, and prior to this book, I'd written 7 other books about the Expos, including the first one in 1997. I had grown up cheering for the Expos while, growing up near Ottawa, which is about 2 hours west of Montreal. So I went to a number of Expos games in the 1970s and 1980s before I became a beat writer. So, but if I had not become a beat writer in 1988, it would be safe to assume I would not be writing all of these Expos books.
And the Expos left Toronto now, left Montreal now about 25 years ago. It's hard to believe it's been so long. And when I was growing up very far from Montreal, I was in San Francisco rooting for the Giants, which was about maybe as far from Montreal as maybe the Padres as you can get, and the Dodgers in the National League at the time. But I was always kind of fascinated. Here was this city on the other side of the continent in a different country where they spoke French. It was the only time I thought my middle school French was ever useful was, when I would try to pay attention to the Montreal Expos. But, different cities, and Montreal is the most recent city to lose a team, right? I mean, there's not been a lot of franchise movement since then. We all know the stories of, the Dodgers leaving Brooklyn, and less so, the Athletics leaving Philadelphia and things like that. But what was the relationship between the city and the team in Montreal?
I think for a number of years, the Expos had a warm relationship for a number of years, and then cool and then cold relationship. From 1969 to 1985 is where I figured the Expos had some, reasonably good fan support, especially in that period from 1979 to 82, when they had some really good teams. And then I would say that the fan support, generally speaking, wasn't very good, especially after Gary Carter was traded following the 1984 season. In the last few years, when Major League Baseball owned the team, there was very little support, as you know, for the team. Many of the fans didn't like the idea of Major League Baseball owning the team, but at the same time, a lot of those fans failed to come to the ballpark. So it was a combination of factors that led to the team leaving Montreal. They couldn't find any local ownership group at that time, and Major League Baseball saw that the fans weren't really coming out to support the team, so they decided to send it to Washington.
And during those early years, when the support was better, we're talking the 70s into the early 80s. I mean, how much? I mean, and baseball has a tradition in Montreal that predates the Expos. I mean, the Dodgers, for example, had a farm team there where Jackie Robinson first played professionally. But how much was baseball part of the consciousness, part of the vibe of Montreal? I mean, when we think of Canada, many people might think of hockey, but it's also a baseball town. So what was that like there then?
Well, as you mentioned, for many decades, the Montreal Royals were important part of the landscape in Montreal. Their Dodgers farm team and that's where Jackie Robinson played his first professional season, or at least broke the color barrier in the minor leagues with Montreal in '46, and then in major leagues with the Dodgers in '47 in Brooklyn. But certainly Montreal, for many, many years, had the baseball criteria to be a pretty good baseball town. And from 1962 to '68, that's when the city of Montreal, especially the councillor Jerry Snyder, attended a lot of National League meetings, beating the drums for Montreal to have a major league franchise. And finally, in 1968, the owners decided on Montreal and San Diego for the National League.
So in this book, let's just maybe focus back on the book a little bit. In this book, you spoke to a lot of players, right? I mean, this is and a lot of these players are not names that, your average baseball fan, maybe even your average Expos fan would know. It's not all, Gary Carter, Andre Dawson, Tim Raines. It's a lot of players, Mike Stenhouse or Doug Flynn and people like that. And to some baseball fans, including me, that's fascinating, right? Those are, I've heard enough about the big stars. But what did you learn from that? And why did you pursue that approach?
Well, I've always been a big fan of part-time players or fringe players because they contribute to the success of the team along with the star players, like you mentioned, Carter, Dawson, and Raines. On any given team, there are only a few star players. And after that, it's taken up by average or above average players who are not star players. So by talking to some of these guys, like, you mentioned Doug Flynn and Mike Stenhouse and Ken McKenzie and Larry Lintz and Mike Gates and so on, it's my way of paying tribute to these guys and paying dedication to them because of their contributions to the team, because they helped to make that team successful, or they were good enough to make that team. In the case of Ken McKenzie, a Canadian, he never appeared in a game for the Expos, but he was on the roster at the end of the '69 season for 27 days to qualify him for a major league pension. So that I thought was a very interesting story. You get a guy like Ken Phelps, who only played a few games for the Expos, but the draw for me, Lincoln, for Ken Phelps was that he was mentioned in the Seinfeld TV show,
right?
Because he was the guy sent to the Yankees from the Mariners in exchange for Jay Buhner, who starred in Seattle, but Ken Phelps, wasn't really a star player with the Yankees. But Ken Phelps was kind enough to talk to me. He was a great minor league player for the Expos, and some of these guys that I wrote about were great in the minor leagues, and for whatever reasons, when they got to the Expos, because they were more talented players with the Expos, they never got enough of a chance to show what they had, like Mike Stenhouse and Mike Gates, and shortly after, their careers ended.
And many of the guys you talked to probably hadn't played in the big leagues in 20, 30 years, maybe even more. And, they didn't have 10-year, 15-year careers, as you pointed out. When you approached them and said, I'm presumably you got in contact, I'm writing a book about the Expos, can we talk? How did they speak about their major league careers, which is now a chapter of their life that in most of those cases is over? What was their perspective on that?
Yeah, well, they guys like Jeff Parrott, let's say, and Bill Sampson, two relievers, and Bert Roberge, and Greg Bargar, who played in the Canadian city of Saskatoon in 1979. They all appreciated playing in Montreal because that gave them some service time. They enjoyed their time there. They may not have, spent too much time there, but they certainly enjoyed being there. Like Mike Stenhouse, he get caught up in the numbers game. He wasn't, he said if he had been able to play full time, he probably would have excelled in the major leagues, but he never got that chance. So those guys really appreciated being in the major leagues. Like Doug Flynn, he played there a few years, and he really enjoyed playing in Montreal. He developed some great relationships. That's the thing with some of the players. They really enjoyed the friendships that they gained with some of the new teammates that they had in Montreal.
And again, these aren't recent players, right? This is when you read the book, these are not guys who, played on elite travel programs from the time they were 10 and then were recruited to go to top. The stories are much more winding, much more serendipitous paths to the major leagues. And that reflects the different era, right? It's a different game now in that regard. But what's special about this era, which in my reading of the book is from about, the mid 60s or late 60s, really, to the mid 80s, right? This is when most of these guys were playing. What interests you about that era? What do you feel was special about it, and from a baseball perspective?
Yeah, like when they first started out in 1969, that was the early days of expansion. I guess that was the first time that there had been expansion for quite a while.
Well, 1962. So it was the 62 and then the 69 expansion in the National League.
What's that again?
Because in the early 60s, the American League expanded in 60, the National League in 62, and then there was the 69 expansion.
That's right. So like in 69, there's very few teams in baseball at that time, even adding those teams. So you had the best players in baseball playing in the major leagues, and a lot of so-called good players were still playing in the minor leagues. So, the interesting thing about the Expos when they first were granted the franchise, there was a chance that Montreal would not have a team starting in '69 because they had trouble gaining local ownership, and Charles Bronfman came to the forefront and put together the money to get the team going. And the interesting story is that, a lot of local ownership wanted to put in some money, but it wasn't enough money. And Charles kind of saved the day. And instead of the team moving to Buffalo, the team stayed in Montreal. And you have to say, clap your hands for Charles Bronfman for keeping that team in Montreal. But that team, that era, 69, the 70s, a lot of the players were, they were the best in the league at that time. Some of them had to go back and forth to the minor leagues, but later on, I think the baseball got better in the 80s, but the caliber of players that were playing in the 80s and the 90s really improved Major League Baseball.
So there's this period in Expos history, which you've alluded to already, which is the late 70s and early 80s, and we could say 79 to 82 was the heart of that period, where the Expos have a very, very good team. I think for those, that 4-year period, perhaps the best team in baseball. Loaded with stars. I mean, Gary Carter and Andre Dawson are future Hall of Famers in their prime. Steve Rogers, frankly, is in my view a borderline. He's not in the Hall of Fame, but there are worse pitchers than Steve Rogers in the Hall of Fame. Warren Cromartie and Ellis Valentine, all these great players, and they never quite get over the hump. I want to talk about that one Dodger series a little bit in specifics later, but for now, tell me about that team. I mean, that team always struck me as a very special team, but again, I wasn't there in Montreal. What was the feeling then around that era and that team?
Steve Garvey told me one time in Cooperstown that he called that the golden era of baseball, golden age of baseball, rather. And he was probably true from 79 to 83, 84. And certainly that applied to the Expos, because from 1969 to 78, the Expos had never made the playoffs. Well, they never made the playoffs until 81, but from 69 to 78, they never had a team reach 500. So 1979 was the first year that they reached 500, and they're well above 500 at 95 and 65, and it got down near the end of the season, and the Pirates beat them out, and it's very unfortunate, but that was a tremendous team. And then in 1980, there was another tremendous team, and they lost out to the Phillies with Mike Smith hitting the home run off of Stan Bonson in the 10th inning. That was a bad moment in Expos history too. But, the team kept getting better and better. And then, they finally get to the postseason during the strike-shortened season in 1981. And then, they had 1982 when they had another great team. And even some people, Lincoln, say the 1983 team was very good, and then they faded at the end of the season. But, 1981 was a great team where they finally made the playoffs.
And when did Tim Raines, remind me, when did Raines, he was early 80s, right?
That's right. From 1981 to 87, he was one of the best players in Major League Baseball.
Oh, yeah.
And then, but that was his first year of a full
in
season.
81, they have Raines, Dawson, and Carter, from a pretty good kind of Hall of Fame nucleus there. What always struck me about those teams is that they had some great players and some real weaknesses. The middle infield, was never good enough. The pitching beyond Steve Rogers was never quite good enough. But I want to talk about that. And I know this is a tough topic for Expos fans, and Expos people, but I want to talk about that 81 NLCS. And, I will say this, that I had a strong rooting interest in that because I'd root for pretty much anybody against the Dodgers, being a San Franciscan. So in my world, everybody was rooting very hard for Montreal, and they really wanted them to beat the Dodgers. But Blue Monday, as it's known, it seems to me is one of those baseball moments where it means a lot more in Montreal than it does in LA, right? LA, they've won a few World Series. They're always in the thick of things. This is just another pennant for them. But in Montreal, it was the closest they've got. Walk us through that ninth inning and how it felt back in Montreal and in the kind of Expos universe. And tell for listeners who don't know, fill them in on what I'm talking about when I say Blue Monday.
It was a dark moment in Expos history. It came down to the last inning. Expos manager Jim Fanning decided to bring in regular starter Steve Rogers to pitch the ninth inning with the score tied 1-1. And, he got the first two batters out. Steve Garvey popped up the second, but Ron Say lined a shot to deep left. And I guess the cold air held it up, and Tim Raines hauled it down at the warning track. And, Steve Rogers has told me many times, and a lot of other writers, since then, that his heart was beating in that situation because he was not a relief pitcher. He was a starting pitcher, and the circumstances had changed. He had butterflies in his stomach. His heart was beating. He had the adrenaline was flowing too much, and he was trying to throw the ball 100 miles an hour. And Rick Mundy comes up, a lefty hitting pitcher against Steve Rogers. And that's when Jim Fanning should have brought in Bill Lee, the southpaw, or the lefty Woody Fryman to pitch to Rick Mundy. But he, I guess, out of allegiance to Steve Rogers, he decided to leave Steve Rogers in. And, he got the count to 1-1. And then the next two pitches I noticed on videotape was that he kind of deliberately threw two balls, one high and then one about 2 or 3 feet in front of the plate. And then, but he decided he's going to try to throw a strike, and he grooved it, and Mundy hit it out through the cold, dense air of Olympic Stadium.
And at that moment, I mean, of course, the Expos then get out in the bottom of the ninth. The Dodgers go on to beat the Yankees in the World Series that year. But was there a feeling in Montreal? Was the feeling, I mean, obviously the feeling was devastation, but was it, we'll get them next year, or was it more that was our best chance?
I think that they certainly knew that they had a great team for the 82 season. It was a tremendous letdown to be so close to the World Series. They were going to start playing the next night in New York against the Yankees. And, they thought that they had a pretty good team, probably good enough to win the World Series if they got there. And, what happened was that the Expos offense just kind of died in that series against the Dodgers. They scored 10 runs in 5 games, and it's not really good enough. But I guess that's what happens sometimes in playoff baseball. The games are close. And, some of those star players like Dawson didn't come through in that series. They had a 2-1 lead in the series. And then in the fourth game, that's when they should have won the game. Jerry White had hit a 3-run homer in game 3, and Steve Rogers had pitched a hell of a game in game 3 to give the Expos a 2-1 lead. In all fairness to Steve Rogers, he had some tremendous games in the playoff series against the Phillies. He beat Steve Carlton twice, and then he won the game earlier in the series against the Dodgers. He had a tremendous series. And to this day, he tells me that he's not bothered by the fact that he gave up that home run. Well, sure, it bothered him, but he said, look at all the great games I pitched in the playoffs that year. So,
and that was the year, for people who don't remember, where because of the strike, there was the split season. And to get to the NLCS, you had to win what was then called the Division Series or something, between the winner of the first half and the second half. So that's the Philly Expo series that you're talking about, right?
Yeah. And so the other thing too that Steve Rogers points out to me, and maybe some other writers, that in '81 he was the union rep for the Expos who attended the bargaining sessions with Major League Baseball. So in a roundabout way, he's saying, okay, I helped get Major League Baseball back on the playing field. And that is another factor that where fans should not be down on Steve Rogers too much, because he helped get baseball back on the field, and he had some tremendous moments in the postseason.
Well, let me just ask a question about Steve Rogers, because again, when I was in that period of baseball as a fan, I always thought that Steve Rogers was kind of one cut down from Steve Carlton, who was, probably the best pitcher in the National League. There's Carlton, Seaver, Fernando came along, but Rogers was maybe one cut down from those guys, and certainly consistent, top-notch starting pitcher for quite some time. And one of those players who's overlooked by a lot of historians. And I always think of him and Dave Steve, both playing in Canada, both excellent pitchers, and not really recognized. But I'm wondering, in the Expos community, how is Steve Rogers viewed? Is he the guy who gave up that home run, or is he the guy who was maybe the best pitcher in Expos history?
I think his legacy is the fact that he pitched tremendously for 12 plus seasons for the Expos. He pitched so many complete games. I wish I had the number to say, but in that era, Lincoln, the pitchers were going 9 innings all the time.
Right.
Not now, where they're protecting the pitcher's arms, but he logged a lot of innings for the Expos and struck out a lot of batters. He so many complete games, and he was just a star pitcher for the Expos for so long. One of the best players in Expos history, especially for longevity. Pedro Martinez was there for 4 years. He also wore uniform number 45. But I say that in terms of competition and longevity, that Steve Rogers was the best pitcher in Expos history.
And Martinez, as great as he was, I always think he's probably more associated with the Red Sox than the Expos, I would think. So skipping ahead to another, I think, a kind of extraordinary moment for a very good Montreal Expos team, which was 1994, which another strike year. This time the strike was not settled, and roughly the last third of the season and the entire postseason was canceled. And many people believe that the Expos were the best team in baseball that year, and if they'd had a chance, they might have won the World Series. Now, this is kind of the tail end of the period you're talking about, but it does come up in your book. Tell me a little bit about that 94 team and the feeling around that.
Well, that team oozed with talent. The starting with pitching included Pedro Martinez, Ken Hill, Jeff Fassero, and Butch Henry. And you had John Wetland, Mel Rojas, Tim Scott, Joe Heredia, and Jeff Shaw in the bullpen. And you had some pretty good position players like Marquise Grissom and Larry Walker and Darren Fletcher, Will Cordero, Mike Lansing. And you had a great manager in Felipe Lou. They really had the guns, their all-purpose team to win it all. They were 74-40 at the time of the strike, and was very, very unfortunate. that the two sides could not have said, okay, let's continue this season and continue the negotiations in the off season. But the Major League Baseball owners and Bud Selig dug in their heels, and the Players Association under Donald Field dug in their heels too. And in the end, it was the players that went on strike, but it was also the owners and Bud Selig who kind of contributed to the whole mess.
Right.
And that was like a knife in the balloon for the Expos, because the following spring, the managing general partner, Claude Boucher, decided he had to get rid of some of those guys to save money. Like they had to trade Ken Hill and Marquise Grissom and John Wetland, and they didn't offer Larry Walker a contract. It's very, very much a tragedy.
And I wonder, as we think of that team, because you mentioned Felipe Alou, who is, I think Felipe Alou is one of the most kind of the most overlooked in terms of his impact on the game. He was a hugely important guy for the history of baseball. And I wonder if that team does go all the way, maybe people look at Felipe Alou's Hall of Fame candidacy a little differently, because he was a good manager for a long time, but he never won it all. And that was his best chance to do that. I want to ask about your interviewing and talking to all these players in your book. I've talked to a number of people over the years who have done projects, books, and other things that require, reaching out to players from long ago who, as we said earlier, are not the biggest stars. Tell me about that. What are some of the stories about, getting a hold of a player, that process, some of the ones that listeners might be interested in?
Well, it's interesting. That's an interesting question. I've sent postal letters to some players where I found out their address online, or if I can't get a hold of them by phone. It's all a part of Googling, or you may have contacts with the Expos, the alumni people with the Expos who might have a phone number, but a lot of players, you don't know their numbers, and they wouldn't have the numbers, so you go through different channels. You try to send them emails or get a hold of them on phone. Doug Flynn, I think he still works for a bank in Lexington, Kentucky. So that's how I sent an email to him at the bank, and he responded. And he said that he didn't really do many interviews, but he was wondering where I was coming from and what he I wanted to do. So we ended up talking, and he gave me a tremendous interview. But here's a story about Doug Flynn. My favorite story, one of my favorite stories in the book, is how he ended up meeting his wife, which they're still married after 40 plus years. They're married in 92. So he was set up by Pete Rose. So this was in 1981, and Doug was playing for the Mets at the time, and Pete was playing for the Phillies. And this is a conversation they had at first base during a game on the field. So Flynn gets on base, and Doug says to Pete, "So how about this girl that you're setting me up on the blind date?" Well, Pete said, "There's the good news and the bad news." And Doug said, "Well, what's the good news?" Well, the good news is that she's really good looking. And then the bad news is that she's engaged. But they ended up meeting at a restaurant, and somehow Olga Muniz, Doug's eventual girlfriend and wife, decided to leave his girlfriend and get married to Doug Flynn. So that was a really interesting story. And then somewhere during the 82 season, Doug Flynn ends up being traded to the Expos. So him and Olga, moved to Montreal, and Pete Rose was with the Expos that year because they had signed him as a free agent, and they ended up, the two couples, renting hotel rooms at the same hotel in downtown Montreal in 1984. So it's quite a story.
Just one last question here, because we talked a lot about these kind of the Expos in the past tense. There's this period they played in Montreal, they moved to Washington, they became the Nationals, missing out both in 81 and 94 on potentially World Series teams. But maybe we could end by looking into the future, not predicting, because, I always get it wrong when I predict the future, but just thinking about it. Will baseball come back to Montreal? Will there be a Expos Part 2? Do you see that happening?
It's a possibility, maybe in a few years, for expansion or relocation of a franchise. But Lincoln, the sales were taken out of the Expos enthusiasm a few months ago when the commissioner's office canceled the split season concept between Montreal and Tampa Bay. Now, that concept was not a very interesting concept. It was almost foolish to even think of something like that, to have Tampa Bay playing, 40, 41 games in Montreal and then playing 40 games in Tampa Bay. It just didn't make sense. The Players Association had raised concerns about, players having to get apartments in Montreal along with living in Tampa Bay. Now, but the ownership group led by Stephen Brompton and Mitch Garber were really enthusiastic about that split season concept, because it was baseball in Montreal in some format, whether it was just a half a season in Montreal. They were ready to pursue that scenario. But I think that Stephen Brompton and Mitch Garber, their interest in baseball, I think, is almost minimal right now. Their enthusiasm has been punctured a lot.
So you're not optimistic about this? You're not optimistic about this chance of this happening?
I think it'll be interesting to see if expansion takes place, if Montreal actually puts in an application. My thought about this is that, can the Montreal ownership group afford a full-time team, which may cost billions of dollars, whereas that split season concept was like maybe half the money?
Right.
I don't know. In a few times, the value of a major league franchise is going to just go up and up. I think the Marlins were sold a few years ago, for $1.4 billion, but that price expansion franchise, and I'm only taking a guess, maybe $2 billion in a few years, and then they got to build a new stadium in Montreal. I don't know. It's I think even the fans in Montreal lost their enthusiasm. At least a lot of them lost their enthusiasm when that split season concept was shot down.
All right. Well, I was hoping to end on a more optimistic note, but thank you anyway. This has been a great discussion. This is the Lincoln Mitchell with the Pandemic Baseball Book Club. We're here today speaking with Danny Gallagher, and the book again is Bases Loaded: Inside Stories about Eli, Crow, Cy, Terminator, and the Expos. Danny, thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Lincoln. It's been a blast.
Great talking to you.